We meet at a time when the principles that I just mentioned are under attack from a very familiar foe. The Bulgarian government's findings that Hezbollah was behind the July 2012 terrorist attack, and the very dramatic confession in Cyprus a week or two ago that a plot in Cyprus was backed by Hezbollah. This is a very timely topic, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues to help us explore this issue further. Exploring the issue first is my colleague Tony Badran, who is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He was born in Lebanon and grew up in the United States, is incredibly well-read throughout the government. He knows more about Hezbollah's functioning than just about anybody else, and we're excited to have you with us today. Matthew Levitt has been at the forefront of this conversation as well and has produced really invaluable research on the topic of Hezbollah. You've got a new book coming out, Matt. I'm sure you'll have the pleasure of getting a peek inside of it during our conversation today. I know that Matt has served for many years in government, both as an analyst at the FBI and as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the Treasury Department. Benjamin Weinthal, my Berlin-based colleague, is also a fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracy, who serves as our eyes and ears on the ground in Central Europe. His reporting, I should mention that Benny just returned from Sofia, Bulgaria, where he was reporting at the time that the Burgess investigation was released, and we're looking forward to hearing your on the ground, your reflections from your time on the ground. Benny's work appears in dozens and dozens of outlets around the world. I'll start this afternoon's conversation by asking each of you a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And Tony, I think I'd like to start with you, taking kind of a 30,000-foot look at Hezbollah. Can you talk a little bit about Hezbollah's role in Lebanon and the region? What role do they play regionally?
Thanks again for arranging this important panel, Toby, and thank you all for coming. Hezbollah right now is pretty much the most powerful actor in Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah's control over the various institutions of the Lebanese state is growing exponentially, but this has not meant that Hezbollah is a local Lebanese actor, right? So Hezbollah, from its inception, its very mission was to be regional, to be a regional, basically arm for Iran in the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean. The way we're seeing that now most prominently is obviously in Syria, where Hezbollah has become effectively the southern and the western flank of whatever remains of the Assad regime. So what you're seeing now is through the adjacent border areas between Lebanon and Syria, specifically in the northern Bekaa Valley, which are right across the border from central western Syria, and specifically the city of Homs and its countryside. Hezbollah has been deployed there along with its Quds Force partners from the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And has been effectively conducting operations there on behalf of the regime. The areas, these are all areas that are very important logistically for the regime, but it also allows Assad to redeploy his very limited forces to defend in Damascus, for instance. But also, this Hezbollah's deployment allows it to safeguard a corridor from Damascus to the coast, where the Assad regime has its sort of communal stronghold. So basically, Hezbollah is an active participant in the Syrian war with elements from the Quds Force as well on the side of the regime. Now this is hardly a new role for Hezbollah. They've done it during the Iraq war when many Shiite militias in Iraq were being trained directly by Hezbollah cadres. and there were Hezbollah officials on the ground in Iraq helping them. And we know, for instance, the case of Ali Makdouk, who was recently released. I mean, he was one a prominent example of this synergy, really inseparable synergy between the Quds Force and Hezbollah. So these are, I mean, we can talk about other examples as well, but Hezbollah's deployment is everywhere, including in the Gulf. There's an issue now with the United Arab Emirates and Lebanese diaspora there because of Hezbollah involvement there. There's been in the past with Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Not too long ago, in 2009, for instance, there was a spy cell that was involved in smuggling also weaponry to the Gaza Strip. So the notion of Hezbollah as a local actor, I mean, I think it's time that we bury that falsehood once and for all.
Just sticking for one moment, Tony, in the region, there have been reports that Hezbollah has sent 1,500 fighters over into Syria,
Right.
and that they've participated in the massacre of civilian population. Any truth to that?
I mean, obviously, Hezbollah has been forced to admit more and more of its involvement in Syria. Previously, they had denied it, but it became harder to deny when sort of a steady stream of coffins of Hezbollah fighters was coming in from Syria, and then there were all these very mysterious burials of Hezbollah officials who were said to have been performing their jihadi duty, but they never say where. Now, a lot of these guys, obviously, they were in adjacent areas to Syria, in the Hermel, in the Bekaa region of Lebanon. And then it came out that, especially after a very senior commander of operations in Syria, Ali Nassif, was murdered assassinated by Free Syrian Army rebels in Syria earlier in 2012, about September, I think, or October 2012. So now it's become far more difficult for them to hide it, and everybody essentially knows it now, and they're even lobbing Grad rockets from across the border from Lebanon onto areas in Syria, as I noted earlier. But that's primarily where they're deployed.
I want to quickly move to Europe and ask Benny and Matt some questions about Bulgaria and Cyprus and the investigations there. Benny, as I mentioned, you were recently reporting from Sofia, Bulgaria. Can you share a little bit about what the pulse was on the ground in Bulgaria when the announcement was made, the very important finding that Hezbollah was behind the so-called Burgas attack? I just want to mention that, well, anyway, take that question, I'll come back.
Sure. Just before I delve into that question, I just wanted to follow up on one point Tony made about Ali Daktu. Just by way of background, in 2007, U.S. intelligence sources, military sources, attributed a very important role to him in the murder of 5 U.S. soldiers. He was released, I believe, late last year, and is now, if I'm not mistaken, in Lebanon. So the war, Hezbollah's war against the U.S. Continues, and he remains scot-free in Lebanon. In terms of Bulgaria, Sofia, I'll spend about, it's Friday, about 2 hours on this, so I know you'll have some patience to sit with me. The reaction initially, I think, was of, at least to a number of folks I spoke to in Bulgaria, was of being somewhat ambushed, that the Bulgarian authorities actually used the H word, Hezbollah, as the agent behind, at least 2 suspects behind the murder of 5 Israelis and their Bulgarian bus driver in Burgas on July 18, 2012, and the injuries, severe injuries to over 30 Israelis on that day. There was some arm twisting. It was in the New York Times. This is all open source information from the side of the Germans and the French. That is, they were twisting the arms of the Bulgarians to not mention Hezbollah explicitly, but to use some type of deliberately nebulous language that the trail leads back to Lebanon. The Bulgarians, to their credit, defied that pressure and conducted, in my view, a very exhaustive investigation, a very methodical investigation, and they came to conclusions that I don't think are, at least to the folks that closely follow Hezbollah, as being anything out of the ordinary. There was some discussion about the role of the U.S. and Israel in terms of the investigation. I didn't see pressure, at least that's what some segments of the Bulgarian media were reporting, that there was pressure from the side of the Israelis and the Americans. There was, of course, assistance in terms of the investigation, but I didn't see that type of pressure taking place. That was sort of the lay of the land in Bulgaria right now.
And Matt, I'm just going to follow up with you on these two investigations. What did these investigations teach us about Hezbollah that we didn't already know in terms of their sophistication, their organizing, their financing, fundraising, that sort of thing?
Sure.
By the way, I should mention, there was a terrific piece in the Washington Post earlier this week by Joby Work, which is outstanding, reported extensively, and I sense that you're you're following this very closely.
I am, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, especially with two people who have done great work on the subject, and to be able to engage in a series of shameless promotions of my book. Starting now. Before I answer your question, let me just note that this issue of Al-Musa Dakduk and Hezbollah's Unit 3800 in Iraq, not only plug number 2 is a full chapter in the book, but more importantly, it ties directly into the issue of our panel today. There's only one country in Europe that has designated all of Hezbollah as such, that's the Netherlands. There's only one other country that's designated certain wings of Hezbollah, and that's the UK. Until the recent war in Iraq, the UK had only designated the terrorist wing of Hezbollah, what we call the Islamic Jihad Organization here in the United States, what they call the External Services Organization, External Security Organization, ESO. But it was because of the activities of Al-Musa Dakduk and others in Iraq, because in particular of one plot where they were plotting to kidnap British servicemen when they went to the latrine, that led the British authorities to expand their designation to include the full military wing of Hezbollah, the Islamic Resistance, so it ties in directly, and it pulls the carpet out from under the myth, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, that yes, Hezbollah was involved in international terrorism in the 1980s, maybe the 1990s, but then it stopped. Maybe the little interlude with Khobar Towers in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia in 1996, but really other than that, it stopped. In fact, throughout this period of time, Hezbollah has been engaging in a whole host of different activities. We can explain, if we have the time, why it did and didn't do some of these things, but especially in Europe, which it treats as its near abroad. What these two attacks, the arrest in Cyprus was on July 7th, and of course the Burgas bombing was on July 18th on the anniversary of the Amia bombing in Argentina in '94, what they demonstrated was two things. One, that Hezbollah is no longer only engaging in fundraising in Europe hand over fist overtly like the Red Cross, which it can do because it's not designated at any level within the EU, not any branch or wing at all, at the EU level, and domestically, as I said, only in 2 countries. And not only providing logistics for activities that will happen elsewhere. So for example, in the 1990s, Hezbollah went on a kick, its Unit 1800, its unit dedicated to support the Palestinian terrorist groups, went on a kick infiltrating people into Israel to carry out surveillance, in some cases to carry out actual bombing attacks, by sending them through Europe as a U-turn, giving them either false documents or several of them, like we saw in Cyprus, for example, and Thailand 6 months before Cyprus in January of last year, people with dual citizenship. That's the first thing, that we're now seeing that Hezbollah is engaged in bombing Europe again. And it's telling that some people put it to me that yes, on the periphery, but at the time that the plot was happening in Cyprus held the rotating presidency of the EU, which is kind of telling. A. B, Hezbollah had gotten back into the international terrorism business in a big way after pulling back many of its foreign agents after 9/11 because it was desperate not to be caught in the crosshairs of what was then called the war on terrorism. This actually, maybe ironically, drove it closer to Iran, and the U.S. intelligence community now describes the Iranian-Hezbollah relationship as a strategic partnership, not a proxy patron relationship, but a strategic partnership with Iran, of course, as the primary partner. people say, why would Hezbollah be engaged in these types of attacks now and bring all this attention to itself when it has all these problems that Tony explained so well in Lebanon and Syria? And the answer is that Hezbollah has a Lebanese identity, and it does. It has a Shia identity, true. It also has an identity in terms of its commitment to Iran, to the Waliyat al-Faqih, to the guardianship of the jurisprudent, the idea that if the supreme leader of Iran says to do something, that is to be done. And it may not be that every foot soldier subscribes to that, but the senior leadership of Hezbollah absolutely does. So the next thing that Cyprus and Bulgaria show us is that, unlike the operations that they tried to carry out after the assassination of their chief terrorist, Imad Bughnia, who was killed in Damascus in February 2008, and they tried to carry out retaliatory attacks against Israel. Israel promised an open war, quote unquote, against Israel, and they failed in Azerbaijan, they failed in the plot that Tony mentioned in Egypt, they failed several times in Turkey, they had plots looking to kidnap people, in one case in Europe, a couple of times in Africa. They took a break at Iran's command. They pulled people from the militia, from the resistance, very highly trained, very capable, trained them in dark arts, rebuilt the IJO, and now, with this kind of patient tradecraft, they were able to carry out the type of operations that they were known to be responsible for in the past. Burgas, Bulgaria was not the first attempted attack in Bulgaria. 6 months earlier, Hezbollah targeted a bus of Israelis traveling through Turkey on their way to a ski trip in Bulgaria. And reportedly, just a week later, a Quds Force officer was captured surveilling a synagogue in Sofia, indicating and underscoring again how well Hezbollah has been tasked with targeting Israeli tourists worldwide. The Quds Force remains committed to targeting Western, that is to say, Israeli, American, British, Saudi, and other diplomats internationally. Of course, we saw that in February with the simultaneous attacks, nearly simultaneous attacks that were carried out in Georgia and India and in Thailand. Here we have real tradecraft. If you look at the Cyprus case, and there's a lot more coming out shortly on the Cyprus case, an individual who first was spotted because he had a European passport and had an import-export company, was then trained very slowly, methodically, different types of training, handed off from trainer to trainer, told every time he met with a Hezbollah person in Beirut that he wasn't allowed to bring a cell phone. Eventually given small missions, served as a courier first to Turkey, then to France and Lyon. Who was he meeting in Lyon? What was this about? What was he delivering? What type of Hezbollah business is going on in Lyon, France? I intend to ask the French when I go there in a week and a half. He went to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, the same, in one case delivering, in another case receiving a cell phone. And then he went to Cyprus, first on an all-paid vacation, to build a cover story and to do simple things like present his face and be friendly so people would recognize him when he came back. And he did this very carefully and methodically. This is the type of tradecraft that is what we've known Hezbollah to be able to do in the past. This is what makes Hezbollah such a capable foe. The fact that they're doing this again suggests that they have replenished or rebuilding that international capability. They're no longer going back to cells that were pre-existing, like the one in Egypt or the one in Thailand, which were sending material to other places in Egypt, into the Gaza Strip, in Thailand, to South America and other places, and saying, well, you're mostly a weapons procurement and transshipment hub, now do some operations, and having people do things they weren't necessarily trained in. Now they have things that are set up in advance. There are other plots that are going on now, and there are some that haven't been talked about, including, for example, surveillance at the airport in Johannesburg, South Africa.
So I just want to stick with this topic for a moment, Matt. There have been a lot of discussions about whether more European countries should designate Hezbollah, given the overwhelming evidence of Hezbollah's increased terrorist activity. What would be the value of designating Hezbollah, number one? And number two, what would it take for the EU and for each of the 27 member countries to designate Hezbollah?
So at the end of your question, you hit the nail on the head. The EU is a membership organization that works by consensus, and it's got 27 cats to herd. And when you go, as I have, and speak to EU members, they say, well, you really need to speak to the EU itself. They say, well, you really need to speak to EU member states because the member states need to vote. You go to the member states and they say, well, we really need to get the EU on board on this. And so they all point at each other. They can't do that anymore. They can't say anymore, well, they're not doing things here. Things are blowing up in Europe. And in some ways, the Cyprus case, even though no one was killed, thank God, it was thwarted, is going to be much more powerful. Because it's not some government saying, this is our conclusion, take my word for it. This is evidence that's being put forth in trial. It's being evidence that is undergoing scrutiny and cross-examination. And there will, hopefully, without meaning to be prejudicial, but perhaps there will be a conviction in a European court. And that will go very far. And I think that's going to create a tremendous amount of pressure. I told the Europeans there are 4 buckets of issues they need to think about when they consider what Hezbollah is and whether or not they should be doing more about it. One is Hezbollah's terrorist activity, and we've covered that. The second is Hezbollah's criminal activity. Hezbollah is involved in more criminal activity than anybody else in the terrorism business. They used to be second to the FARC, but the FARC is now a criminal enterprise that dabbles in terrorism as opposed to what it used to be, which was a terrorist enterprise that dabbled in criminal activity. In particular, while there's all kinds of small-scale criminal activity, Hezbollah's involvement in the movement of narcotics and the laundering of the proceeds of narcotics, not production, but movement and laundering, especially through and to Europe, is something that has the Europeans' attention. When U.S. law enforcement approaches countries in Southern Europe and point this out, they may not say, yes, we'll work with you on this Hezbollah guy, but they'll say, yes, we'll work with you on this narcotics trafficking guy. And the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal Europe may not report Hezbollah guy busted, but it's the same guy, and they understand that. That has their attention. So terrorist activity, criminal activity, and then the 2 other things get to what Tony said. Regional stability, and I don't need to go through what Tony said again, other than to say, the State Department now describes Hezbollah in Lebanon as being part of the Assad regime's killing machine. Full stop. But then the last thing, this really gets to the heart of your question, Toby, the real big sticking point for France in particular, which has dug in its heels and is the biggest impediment here. In this next trip, I'm going to 3 European countries, 1.5 days in one country, 1.5 days in Germany at the end, see you in Berlin, and then 4 days in Paris in the middle, is that they feel that this would undermine stability in Lebanon. Now, first of all, I think that I have no illusions that the EU will actually designate Hezbollah as such. At most, I would hope that they would follow the British model and designate the military and terrorist wings. That would be not as effective in stemming the flow of funds, because you'd minimize the size of what you're able to target. If anybody will raise funds for Hezbollah political cause, you might not be able to stop that, even though money is fungible. But it would get us at least started in the right direction. And the reason I say that is because at least then the French would be able to say, we haven't done anything to target the politicians back in Lebanon. My point to people who make this argument is, in what Alice of Wonderland kind of world can you make try and make a stand and argue that Hezbollah is anything but a destabilizing force in Lebanon? Hezbollah dragged Israel and Lebanon both into a war neither country wanted in 2006. Hezbollah took over downtown Beirut by force of arms, taking arms that were supposed to be only for the quote-unquote resistance against Israel and turning them against fellow Lebanese citizens, leading to the deaths of fellow Lebanese, an act that the government of New Zealand cited as an act of terrorism, and cited as one of the reasons the government of New Zealand, designated the military wing of Hezbollah because of what they did in the spring of '08 in Beirut, because of what they're doing in Syria. And look now most recently, for example, I think it's very telling how much their identity in terms of a partner with Iran is trumping their Lebanese identity. Look at this fall when Hezbollah flew a drone over southern Israel near Dimona, where it's believed Israel has a nuclear reactor. The Israelis made clear, like it, you don't like it, it's nice, it's not nice. The Israelis made clear once Hezbollah became the dominant force in the government, they were no longer going to make a distinction between Hezbollah and government, Hezbollah the party. Which is why officials tell me Nasrallah doesn't let people look in the direction of the blue line. You can do Cyprus, you can do Bulgaria, that's reasonably deniable, but you can't cross the blue line. But here they're willing to fly this drone over southern Israel so that Iran can get the intel, which is what Iran says, that's not my conclusion. That's the press conference Iran had, knowing full well they had to expect that the Israelis would fly planes over and start bombing things like crazy. Now the Israelis didn't, they showed restraint to their credit, I think. But Hezbollah was willing to put Lebanese lives and property at risk for something that in no way could be explained as being in Lebanon's interest. At the end of the day, a designation would serve as a shot across the bow, making clear to Hezbollah that they can no longer muddy the waters between legitimate activity, social welfare, politics, and illicit conduct, criminal activity, terrorism. And failure to do that is only going to tell Hezbollah, continue as you are because it works. Imagine I leave here, Toby, and I rob a bank. And they catch me red-handed and they say, listen, you're right, I robbed a bank, but you can't arrest me because I'm involved in politics and I give money to charity. Really? It just doesn't fly. The second thing that it would do is it would enable us to have some travel restrictions, and depending on how much of Hezbollah is listed, it would enable European countries to do more to make it at least more difficult for Hezbollah to raise funds in Europe, which again they do hand over fist like the Red Cross today. But most importantly, and John Brennan, the White House counterterrorism advisor, who's been nominated to head the CIA, said this when he spoke in Dublin several weeks ago, the main reason from a kind of core CT perspective, the US government has pushed this, and now post-Bulgaria and Cyprus is trying to just kind of sit back and let the European process go, is because some European countries, including Germany, will still run actual counterterrorism investigations against Hezbollah because they know full well from their history what Hezbollah is capable of doing, what it has done in Europe in the past. Don't need to remind the French either. In 1996, a series of 15 bombings that brought the city to a standstill. Hezbollah's first attack in Europe in 1983 was a Paris-Marseille train. But some countries don't. Some countries will not open a counterterrorism investigation. They'll only investigate Hezbollah if they happen to be engaging in kind of white-collar criminal activity. And if I were a European citizen, I'd be really concerned. Hezbollah is blowing things up in Europe today. You're telling me you can't open up a preemptive counterterrorism investigation? I think that's also going to create some traction for further movement.
So two points you underscored. How can you possibly suggest that a designation would destabilize Lebanon? It's already destabilized, the region is destabilized, but I want to just come back to a nuance here, particularly I think with French and others who have UNIFIL troops in Lebanon. How do you answer the question that the designation of Hezbollah would put their troops in danger, their UNIFIL troops in danger?
And that's what pro-Hezbollah media has been saying. It's an active threat. Right? I mean, that's not. But this is not the first time that Hezbollah has threatened or attacked UNIFIL forces on Lebanon. And you had politicians in Lebanon who are aligned with Hezbollah. One particular one, Riyad Mohammed, which is a very, very colorful character because he actually has no inhibitions about actually making open public threats. I mean, several years back, when it was issues related to the Hariri tribunal, he would come out and say, well, if you do this, then UNIFIL will be the first target. And lo and behold, boom, a Spanish UNIFIL patrol or a French UNIFIL patrol get hit. So obviously, this has created a deterrence for Europe. And when the Europeans say we don't want to destabilize Lebanon, what they really mean, we don't want to destabilize Europe. I mean, because that's the bottom line. I mean, they've had, Matt mentioned the French series of bombings in the 80s, but in the German, there's also in the early 90s as well. But if you look at how the French and the Germans dealt with this, is that they reached a modus vivendi with them. You guys can do this, and we won't really, you can operate in Europe. Just please don't kill us. I mean, now, and now all of a sudden, this is, obviously it's a false agreement. It's never going to be upheld. If Hezbollah feels the need to do it, it will do it. But the threat of and the fear of further destabilization, whether through UNIFIL or in Europe itself, is interesting because I wonder if actually even people are going to go with the military wing designation as opposed to say, we don't want anything to do with this business, which is what Benny sort of said earlier about Bulgaria. They're mad not because Hezbollah has blown up people on European soil. They're mad that Bulgaria kind of let the cat out of the bag. So it's a very peculiar moment also because it's making it very hard on the Europeans to deny this. Not just because of what happened in Cyprus and Bulgaria, but I mean you're seeing all these Quds Force guys on the ground in Lebanon. Just the other, a couple of weeks back, a senior Quds Force military engineer whose alias, he was operating under an alias in Lebanon. And the alias was designated by the Treasury Department in 2010. But we didn't know, or I mean, if Treasury did know, they didn't make public at the time, that this guy was a very top Quds Force commander, and he was, his funeral in Iran was as a Quds Force top commander. This guy's running
Hezbollah flags.
Right, exactly. I mean, the family actually sent condolences not just to the Quds Force and to the Supreme Guide. They sent one to Masala. So that's part of the sympathies of the family. So so these guys are intertwined. They are on the ground, and they are constantly operating in Europe. And they've had a history with the Mykonos bombing, the Paris bombing, and I think the Europeans just prefer to just change the subject. So I am actually, because what they fear most, I think the issue of destabilizing Lebanon is a very convenient veneer, but really, these guys are just worried about themselves.
Okay, so Benny, what is the status of, where are our European friends on designation? We talked about Britain, we've talked about France a little bit, Germany. Bring us up to date.
Well, I think we can't, it's important to emphasize that the European line right now, as Tony and Matthew highlighted, is to not destabilize the Lebanese government. Hezbollah is de facto in charge of Lebanon's government. I had a conversation 2 days ago with the Austrian Foreign Ministry about another topic, Iran's foreign minister showing up at a UN conference on the Alliance of Civilizations, sanctioned, but the EU waived his sanctions and allowed him to travel at this conference, so there was some uproar. But I asked about Hezbollah, and the foreign minister was very, very upset and said, we're not going to get into this. It's going to shatter the government in Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm hearing that from many governments. This line over the last 7-8 months, I think, as Matthew pointed out, the Cyprus case might be a significant moment of truth for the Europeans, because they're very fixated on the legal procedure, which I understand. But as one top German counterterrorism expert said in the German Daily just a few weeks ago in February, the Hamburger Abendblatt, his name's Guido Steinberg from a foundation in Berlin, sort of the preeminent German think tank in Berlin. He said that the criteria has already been met to designate Hezbollah as a terror entity. And the standard's very low, and there's a lot of talk about the judicial process. But the Europeans, in my view, and I don't think it's anything intellectually more complex than this, it's just a question of political will. As Matthew's pointed out in his writings and work, Hezbollah has been debunked. It's a militant global terror entity. It's not a group of cognitive, behavioral, social therapists who are trying to change attitudes. We're dealing with a lethal organization. In terms of Europe right now, you may have seen statements from Frans Timmermans earlier this week, the Dutch foreign minister, who called on the European Union to designate Hezbollah, not a partial designation, a full designation. The Dutch, as was previously mentioned, is the only government that outlaws Hezbollah within the European Union, and he called it a terrorist organization and used very, very strong language and urging his colleagues to stick with a full designation. Germany is a bit all over the map. I think they're amenable to a discussion. Chancellor Merkel said shortly after the Bulgarian report was released, there will be consequences if there's evidence showing Hezbollah was involved in the Burgas attack. With the trial ending in Cyprus on March 7th, and we expect a verdict, I think, on March 7th, there should be crystal clear evidence that Hezbollah has been terrorizing Europeans and tourists. So the German situation is very interesting because, in my view, Germany is the key player. France is vehemently opposed, we know that, but if the Germans change their mind, it might just sway the French. Germany has a huge Hezbollah problem. There are, from 2010 to last year, or 2011, the most recent domestic intelligence report showed an increase of Hezbollah membership in Germany from 900 to 950. I suspect the number is significantly higher. The demonstrations I've observed in Berlin, including last year's Al-Quds demonstration calling for the destruction of Israel and stoking violent anti-American hatred. There were at least 1,000 participants, and the entire demonstration in the heart of Berlin was blanketed with resistance flags, yellow resistance flags. That doesn't mean these folks are active members and plotting the next Burgas, but it shows that Germany has a significant pro-Iranian regime, pro-Hezbollah Shiite community, and that's why that's a factor. But the terrorism attacks, in my view, are going to increase unless Europe draws a line in the sand. I don't see how ignoring this problem is going to make it any better. Just one other point before I end this. In terms of my coverage of Burgess, to my astonishment, and I've noticed this in an increasing number of media reports in Europe, the segments of the European press were largely focused on the 5 Israelis who died. There was a Bulgarian national, EU citizen who died, Mustafa, I'm sorry for the Bulgarians here, help me out with the pronunciation of his last name, Kiosov. At times, many of the media reports in Europe just mentioned 5 Israelis, which I thought was very telling on some level that, I asked one reporter before the Burgess investigation was completed from a very prominent German weekly. I asked her, are you covering the Burgess case? Isn't, Hezbollah in Europe, there's major fundraising operations here. She said, it doesn't affect us.
Just a quick follow-up on the issue of destabilization of the Lebanese government. I mean, Matt mentioned how Israel also views now sort of Hezbollah and the Lebanese government as one of the same in terms of should there be a military conflict. But it's worth noting that a lot of these operations that Hezbollah is doing abroad, especially in Arab countries, are happening because of Hezbollah. There's an operational role for the Lebanese government because of Hezbollah infiltration of the Lebanese government. For instance, Hezbollah has strong influence, if not control, over the general security apparatus in Lebanon, and that's the apparatus that issues passports. So a lot of, like for instance, the operative in Egypt that was arrested in 2009, he was operating with a falsely issued genuine document, and there are others like other such examples. So the Lebanese government effectively is assisting in terror operations abroad, and it happens also because of with the situation in Syria as well. Infiltration by Hezbollah and influence over the military intelligence of the Lebanese armed forces, for instance. Recently, a couple of weeks back, there's a town in the Bekaa that's helping logistically the Syrian rebels across the border, and it's a thorn in both the regime and Hezbollah's side. Obviously, because it's a Sunni town and Hezbollah is a Shiite organization, there's sectarian tension, they can't really just go in and barge in. So what do? They send a unit from military intelligence, which is essentially a hit squad. They go in and they nail a guy who's a logistical liaison between this town and the FSA forces in Nicosia. So you can mention also how it's affected the Lebanese banking system and how that affected their control over the ports of entry into the country. So the destabilization should be seen more than just the issue of military conflict with Israel. And these guys, and with the presence now that we're finding out of very senior Quds Force commanders that are on the ground in Lebanon, I mean, they're really destabilizing every aspect of Lebanese society, from its finances to its social fabric to its general security.
Thanks. I'd like to open it up for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I ask that you keep it to a question and not a speech so we get as many questions in as possible. Any questions? Would you mind waiting for the mic? Mic or mic?
Yeah, George Bailey with the Lebanese Information Center. I would quickly add regarding the destabilization factor in Lebanon, the political assassinations. Of course, I mean, when Hezbollah has been clearly accused to be, after the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri, and after recent assassination of parliamentarian Butrus Harb and other also leaders like Sami Jaja, possibly involved in the assassination of Issam Hassan. So that's a big factor, that's very well known. Question about what can the US do regarding the EU designation. If the EU as a whole does not designate Hezbollah, is it possible for the US to engage individual states and have, for example, a model like the Netherlands, where individual states, and maybe France would be the only one, but at least Hezbollah would not have access to all those countries? And can, for example, the US, like Treasury, based on intelligence information, designate private companies, banks, individuals in France, just, again, to curtail Hezbollah's presence in Europe?
Matt, you want to correct that?
Sure. First of all, you're absolutely right about the political assassinations, and of course, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon investigation, more than anything else, just the optics, if nothing else, of Shia Hezbollah being accused, and not just anybody, but Mustafa Badran being accused of being involved in assassinating the de facto head of the Sunni community. That type of sectarian activity undermining stability in Lebanon in the extreme, you're absolutely right, we should have mentioned that. If, in the event that you don't have a European, an EU-wide designation of anything, or even if you have one but it only goes so far, I think you will absolutely have US follow-up, and I would hope not only US. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, there are other countries that have designated Hezbollah in whole or in part, and I think that we would then go for bilateral arrangements, try and share information so that people could do things unilaterally. So you do what you can, when you can. This is not an either or. You know, most of these countries would probably have to do some type of domestic action to satisfy their legislative and judicial requirements to be able to do something at the EU level, some not. And that's to be expected. On the issue of individual designations, meaning designations of individuals or of individual companies, that also, it's not mutually exclusive. We should be going ahead and doing that. The U.S. Treasury's been doing that for a very long time. It continues to do that. My concern is that while in my past few trips to Europe, and I've been spending a lot of time there on this, I'm going back soon, I have found a much greater receptivity to this issue than ever before. It's also the case that while you don't have to debate with them, is Hezbollah engaged in terrorist activity? Is Hezbollah engaged in criminal activity? They don't have a whole lot of information, in part because they don't run these investigations. When I share with them stuff from the book about what we know about Hezbollah activity in Europe based on American investigations, their eyes get wide. Hezbollah trying to import shoulder-fired missiles to take down F-15s, X-16s through the Slovakian import-export company of a German citizen, for example. I know I will tell you more, you'll have to read it in the book. Or Hezbollah's long-standing and wide operation to counterfeit money internationally, including euro, including other European currencies, and separately to steal money, European and other currencies. There's one case where they stole about $2 million in Swedish kroner, but it didn't go so well, and they still had the die pack, so it got stained with the die pack. How do I get this? All of this in Europe, they're amazed. And my concern, though, is that several European countries, what they'd like to do is say, okay, they're involved in terrorist activity, but we're not going to designate Hezbollah. We'll designate individuals. But that's meaningless. I don't know how many people in the room are aware. Imad Mughniya was on the European Union's list. Hezbollah wasn't. But Mughniya was because of TWA 847 and other things. As if he wasn't part of an organization that trained him and dispatched him and told him to do this. And what good did that do? Absolutely nothing. Didn't do any good whatsoever, including when Mughniya went to Paris and the French refused to arrest him. So that's what you do if you want to say you did something but actually want to do nothing. And it's what France and some other countries are saying, well, that's what we will do to say that we did something. And what Washington and others are saying is, no, we want actual tangible actions that will have some type of impact. We'll empower European countries to run counterterrorism investigations. We'll actually make it more difficult for them to raise money in Europe. Like I said, Europe today is such a convenient, because it's close, and such a convenient because it's a free operating environment for Hezbollah. It is Hezbollah's near abroad. And that's something. So US Treasury or UK FSA designations, yes, and these things should happen. But that should not be in any way, instead of, this should be complementary to.
Other questions?
Just follow up on that.
Sure.
Just quickly, it's an interesting question in terms of the pressure point. One interesting possibility that could be entertained, I've heard, is the notion of the bilateral free trade talks between the European Union and the U.S. The U.S. were to insist, the United States, that before these free trade talks commence, that Europe maintain a terror-free environment. Perhaps that would rapidly change the minds of European leaders. That's one pressure point. I concur with Matt, 100%. Europe is amenable right now to take some type of, impose some type of penalty on Hezbollah. There hasn't been this type of movement in ever, right? And I've been reporting on Hezbollah for 6-7 years now, and I haven't seen this type of bundle of potential. Bulgaria, at least my read right now, is the Bulgarians are pushing for some type of sanction on the military wing. and one German member of parliament who's the spokesman for Chancellor Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, Philip Missfelder, in the Bundestag, he's called for, in the event, absent an EU-wide ban, he's called for Germany to initiate unilateral action to ban Hezbollah within Germany. But again, I think the maximum remedy is the best remedy in this case, in my view, which is the Dutch solution.
Sir.
Thank you. Bill Koenig, Koenig International. Tony, I have a question about Hezbollah there in southern Lebanon. We hear they have about 55,000 rockets or missiles, mostly rockets, deployed, and this has been under the review and under the UN security. Since 2006, they were supposed to keep that from happening, but probably Hezbollah is more armed than ever before. Do you have some more information on that? And the second thing is, how big is the Hezbollah force in southern Lebanon on Israel's northern border?
With your first point, you must have seen recently the reports of an Israeli, highly publicized Israeli strike within Syria on an arms convoy headed to Lebanon. Okay, so this is something. Yes, they have rockets, plenty of rockets, and certainly some other strategic weapons. But the Israelis have made a policy since 2006 of tracking down and sort of preventing the entry into Lebanon of certain types of strategic weapons, especially long-range rockets and ballistic missiles, sophisticated anti-aircraft weaponry, anti-naval, anti-ship missiles like the one that struck in 2006 and almost sank an Israeli warship, which, by the way, was operated also by the Quds Force on the ground, the Israeli military suspected, and tapped into Lebanese army naval radars in order to guide them. So to kind of round out what we've been saying earlier. Now, this is going to be a big, big problem because these guys had deployed a lot of these strategic weapons on Syrian soil in order not to sort of precipitate an Israeli strike, because it was seen that Israel would hesitate to hit the Syrian state, per se, before the rebellion in Syria. Now, these are no longer secure. A lot of them have to be brought in, and they've been bringing them in by the truckloads. Now, whenever Israel, sort of the drone and overflights on the border region are in saturation level right now. So the Israelis are really keeping a very close watch on it, specifically for those types of weapons that I've mentioned. Now, at some point, these things are going to go into Lebanon. And what has happened is that Hezbollah, the Israeli military, has shown and sort of has been keen to make public that they've turned a lot of the civilian neighborhoods and cities and towns in Lebanon, not just in southern Lebanon, but in the Bekaa and other regions of Lebanon, into veritable weapons storehouses and silos. So they're embedded within population centers. So when Israel, it's inevitable, is going to strike at some point, should they manage to bring them into Lebanon, it's going to be massive casualties. And this is, again, part of the theme that we're talking about the utter destabilization of Lebanon. In terms of the fighting force, it's interesting because after 2006, there's been a lot of speculation as to how many Hezbollah fighters were actually killed. And some put that number at about 600 to 700. Now, these are highly trained with operational memory that's been lost, so there's been a very active effort by Hezbollah to send a lot of people to Iran for training. Now, all of these guys, however, don't have combat experience. So it's very unclear what the shape right now of the fighting force, of the elite fighting force, with operation memory and battle experience on the ground in Lebanon. But they've clearly done their best to sort of resupply it.
If I just follow up quickly. I think I would be a little less confident that they lost so many of their exceptionally well-trained people. I'd want to tone that down a little bit. They lost some numbers, we know. We don't know exactly how many. And Hezbollah not only sends people to Iran for training, they have their own training. Shia militants are coming to them for training. Others, Sunni, Somali Shabab are coming to them for training. In the middle of the 2006 war, Iraqi Shia militants and Sunni Shabab militants were both stuck there during the war. They have the capability of training these guys on their own. I recently spoke to one person who has connections in Lebanon and knows some of the Hezbollah people involved and also said that the reserve duty that is going on now, people are a lot more trained, a lot more frequent reserve duty, their capabilities, they're sharpening their capabilities. On the issue of the rockets and missiles in particular, 2 points. One, Hezbollah is concerned because its resupply route is now in disarray. That's good news. The bad news is that without getting another single rocket, Hezbollah has enough rockets for a good 3 or 4 wars. Not salvos, but wars with Israel, and that still gives it a deterrent capacity. One of the reasons Hezbollah is doing all the things it's doing in Syria is because of Iran. The other is because of its own interests. One of its interests is making sure, or trying to make sure, that it maintains a reliable route for missiles, rockets, and other things. And one of the key places where it has been sending things is to the port of Latakia. Again, one of the cases here in the United States, actually no, at least 2 of the cases here in the United States, Hezbollah operatives were saying, don't worry, we'll ship things to Latakia, you don't even need customs, don't need fake documentation, we don't need documentation, Latakia is ours, quote unquote. So they would be very keen in the event that the Assad regime falls, that there be an Alawistan along the coast, north of Lebanon, if for no other reason, because they would want to be able to maintain access, not just access, but control over Latakia.
Question in the back, yes.
Yes, I know today's discussion is about mainly Europe, but the panel mentioned a couple times that Hezbollah now operates in Thailand. So I'm wondering what was the Thai government response, and is Hezbollah expanding to other regions too?
Sure. You know, I think the most surprising chapter in the forthcoming book will be the chapter on Hezbollah in Southeast Asia, where I was able, through interviews and begging for documents, to get a tremendous amount of material from Thailand, the Philippines, Singapore, and elsewhere. And as someone who's been following Hezbollah for many years, I was surprised. Hezbollah has a long history in Thailand, in the region and in Thailand in particular. Most people don't remember, but a few weeks before Hezbollah successfully blew up the Amia Jewish Community Center in July 1994, they nearly blew up the Israeli embassy in Bangkok. That was not thwarted because of counterterrorism measures. It failed because the driver of the van, the vehicle-borne explosive device, got into a car accident with one of those rickshaw drivers in the morning traffic. So we got lucky as opposed to having thwarted it. And ever since then, Hezbollah has had a very significant presence in Thailand. The Thais take this seriously. They're concerned about Islamist militancy in the south in particular, and they're concerned about different types of connections, and they're aware of Hezbollah's activities ever since that 1994 plot, where the US, Israel, and several other countries helped track down this investigation. It therefore wasn't a tremendous shock when we found last January that there was an individual, Hussein Atris, also a dual Lebanese-Swedish citizen, who was captured there, involved in the same type of surveillance of Israeli tourists, but he was conducting surveillance in very popular tourist areas where not only Israeli tourists, but any tourists would go, which led the US Embassy and several other foreign embassies to put up warnings. Even though we don't believe that he was looking to target Americans, he was looking to target somebody in a place where Israelis, Americans, and a whole bunch of other people would be at the same time. What was interesting about that plot in particular was that we found that he had a storehouse north of town where he was putting together chemical precursors to form explosives. He had already crystallized it, which was the first step in weaponizing the material. He was hiding it in material marked cat litter and dog food. It was being shipped all over the world. Some was being shipped to South America. That facility had been rented a year earlier. So for at least a year, this guy had been functioning there. And the belief is that he was there, as I mentioned earlier, to function in this logistical support role. He wasn't sent there to carry out a bombing. But Hezbollah didn't have people they could send right away. They didn't have people who were stationed abroad. And so they leaned on these pre-existing networks and asked them to do things beyond what was originally in their remit. And the Thais were very, very supportive in that investigation. He's still under arrest there and hopefully will be tried sometime.
Other questions? Please.
Katerina Katracheva, Focus News Agency, Bulgaria. I would like to comment 2 points of views which we heard during the public discussion in before and after the releasing of the report in Bulgaria. The one is there was a point of view that releasing this report and mentioning Hezbollah could create danger for Bulgaria. Bulgaria became more and more a target for such attacks. And the other point of view which we heard was that it's not in the interest of Hezbollah to penetrate such attacks in Europe, because Europe is an important field for the activities, other activities of fundraising. We'll talk about it in Europe. So this attack was against its interest. These were 2 points of view which we heard very clearly in Bulgaria, and I would like you to comment.
Penny, why don't we start with you?
I don't think there's any way that one can insulate him or herself from Hezbollah in Europe without cracking down on the organization. I think the opposite has been the case in Europe, that because Hezbollah and its networks throughout Europe, large networks and a fair amount of very sophisticated infrastructure, have been allowed such wide latitude, is one of the reasons these attacks are taking place. When I was in Bulgaria, my sense was based on conversations with some of your colleagues and non-journalists, is that the Bulgarians were sort of just caught off guard by this. They had to revamp their entire counterterrorism structure to deal with these types of attacks in the future. I see the opposite happening. I think you'll create an environment where tourists won't be scared to travel to Bulgaria if this group's infrastructure is eliminated. There's also a Hezbollah presence in Romania. As you know, these two suspects went through Romania and Poland. There's question marks over whether the Shiite communities in Romania helped them with their flight out of Bulgaria. The problem is in Europe, there's hardly, the reporting on this is largely non-existent. On the financial networks of Hezbollah, it's just not on the media radar screen in Europe, in contrast to the United States and Canada, where the group's banned. And there's very little research on Hezbollah's other activities. I'll turn it over to Matt.
You know, I was struck. I did a couple of interviews with National Public Radio in Bulgaria, and I was struck at how dismissive people were of the Bulgarian charges. I think it might have something to do with the fact that you've got a little bit of political turmoil going on in your country right now, and therefore there were some maybe who felt that if the current government said something, then it was just part of their political machinations. Two things. One, on the issue of saying that mentioning Hezbollah would put Bulgaria in danger, I have 2 points to make. One is, 5 years before this attack, U.S. and other intelligence agencies sat down to figure out where does the Quds Force and Hezbollah feel there are places that are ripe for their type of operations. And one of the countries on that list was Bulgaria. This is nothing new. 6 months earlier, Hezbollah had already tried, as I mentioned, to carry out an attack in Bulgaria, and the Quds Force a week later was surveilling a synagogue in Sofia. There's already an issue that Bulgarian security has to deal with. A. B, I don't think that Hezbollah wants to put itself at any more risk than it has to, and I don't think it's going to, like it did in the 1980s, carry out revenge attacks because people look at it the wrong way. This is what the French are concerned about that Tony was mentioning earlier, and the French have experience in this. In the 1980s, France provided weapons to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. So Iran sent its own agents and Hezbollah agents to do things in France, also in Germany. And there was a sense that if you didn't poke your finger in Iran and Hezbollah's eye, they would come and slap you in the face. The world is a different place now. It's not the case that if you designate, if you list, if you say that they're going to start blowing things up all over the place. It's a different world post 9/11. A. B, to the point that it's not in Hezbollah's interest to target Europe, In a sense, you're right. Of course, Europe is a cash cow for Hezbollah, and I mentioned they raise money hand over fist. And on top of that, it's not in Hezbollah's interest as a Lebanese party to do something like this and bring all kinds of unwanted attention, and yet it's doing this. And why? The answer is actually very simple. When the chips are down, Hezbollah's commitment to Iran trumps its identity as a Lebanese political movement. And it trumps its identity even as a Lebanese militant movement. The attacks we're seeing in Europe are not part of Hezbollah's effort to avenge the death of Imam Khomeini. For those attacks, Hezbollah tried to do things in places where the consequences wouldn't be so great, and where counterterrorism measures maybe weren't as good as they might be other places. Here, Hezbollah got a command from Iran as part of our shadow war with the West to deter the West from sending further viruses like Stuxnet, and from further defections of IRGC and further sticky bombs of our scientists, etc. We want you to blow up buses of Israeli tourists worldwide. And that's what Hezbollah has done. And Europe makes a colossal error if it fails to recognize the extent of Hezbollah's commitment to Iran as a proxy for Iran. Tony, you just had an article that the title alone, I read the whole article, but the title alone made this very clear. Hezbollah is Iran's arm. Many people are uncomfortable with this, but I'll tell you one anecdote, and I include it in the book, even though I don't know if it's true. I say that in the book. It might be apocryphal, but I like it, so I'm going to tell it to you. It drives home the point. One of the Hezbollah parliamentarians says that Nasrallah told him that if the supreme leader of Iran asked him to divorce his wife, he would. Now, maybe his wife is a horrible woman, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't say very much at all. But he makes the point to underscore the extent of his commitment to Walayat al-Faqih. And there are a whole bunch of other statements from Nasrallah, Sheikh Naim Qassem, the Deputy Secretary General of Hezbollah. Lots of rumors this week, by the way. Rumors that Naim Qassem was killed, that Nasrallah was in Tehran undergoing cancer treatment. It appears none of them are true. But lots of statements from them where they say in their own words, don't take Matt Levitt's word for it. Listen to Naim Qassem. There's no distinction between our wings, and our commitment to Iran is ironclad. That's why they're doing this.
Just a quick note on the second part of your question, actually. I mean, just look at the reaction after the attack. How everybody actually was dismissing. Everybody wanted to say, even if they knew that it was Hezbollah, that it's not Hezbollah, it's Al-Qaeda. How can you dismiss that as Sunnis and so on? So there is an element of people, that the deterrence that Matt was talking about. Everybody would know what this is, and everybody would cower. And even precisely because they know who it is. And they would try to make an excuse to say it's not, it's not. And there's obviously plenty of information campaigns by people to make sure, oh no, this is the Sunnis are the real problem, not Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda is the real problem. Or, by the Bulgarian opposition who had an interest also in spinning this in a different direction. But I would just look at the reaction to it, to say that, of course Hezbollah and Iran would do it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, they were not supposed to be caught the way they got caught. I mean, there are trails that happened by virtue of accident that were left behind.
Some by virtue of accident, others by virtue of things that they couldn't have anticipated. But the bottom line for Hezbollah and Iran both, they're willing to be extremely aggressive, so long as they can operate in such a way that will provide them reasonable deniability. They do not need to go in only if they think no one can ever catch us. So long as they can look in the microphone and say, not us, I don't know what you're talking about, no matter what you say, it's a Zionist American conspiracy, they're happy. And here I think it's interesting. This was in a piece that I wrote earlier this week. I think Hezbollah is very, very scared. Because unlike after the STL indictments, where Nasrallah issued a whole paper rebutting it, and then he had a big Nasrallah had a press conference last weekend on Saturday. Everybody expected him to rebut Bulgaria. You know the only thing he said in Bulgaria? I don't want to talk about it. When Nasrallah, and losing his boyish charm, gets nervous, you can see it in his face, and says, I don't want to talk about it, instead of saying lies, conspiracy, Zionist conspiracy, he's concerned. And I think he's concerned because it's a 1-2 punch. The Bulgarians came forward their conclusions, but they're not making all of it public. Some of it's apparently based on intelligence, etc. Some of which has been made public. We now know from public reporting that somebody, I presume the Israelis, but I don't know who, had telephone intercepts between known Hezbollah operatives in Beirut and unknown individuals in Bulgaria leading up to the bombing that then stopped immediately after the bombing. But it's not, it's now Cyprus. And this is open source, cross-examined European court.
I would like just, I'm sorry to give you too much time, but to point out that I'm not expressing my view,
Yeah.
but the view among the Bulgarian people, and do you think that it's important, the people, the citizens of Bulgaria or whatever country, to be also persuaded that this decision would be the right decision, not only the government, but also the citizens?
And I think we, I think you can reflect your views on that question in the context of the others, Mira.
Mira Resnick from Congressman Waxman's office. I guess my concern is the process of consensus building. If the French are only interested in designating individuals and another country is only interested in the entire organization, another country is only interested in the military wing, what are the chances that nothing happens, and what are the dangers of doing nothing?
Just real quick, I mean, I would say that I would add even another option that I've heard from friends of mine in government who are working in Europe, said that actually a lot of people say, yes, in fact, the notion that a military wing is separate from a political wing is nonsense. However, that means that we shouldn't designate Hezbollah at all. So they take it into the opposite direction. So I'm highly skeptical, but it's an interesting, it's because it's a unique confluence of factors that people's, might think, and especially the Cyprus case is in public and so on, so maybe something might happen. I remain very skeptical that anything actually is going to happen, because the Europeans simply just want this to go away.
Well, maybe it's because I've been fighting this for so long. I'm more optimistic than I've ever been. That is not to say that anything's going to happen. This is an uphill battle without question, and it is a question of months, not weeks. But I have to tell you, when I was last there were people that I've had this argument with for years, in and out of government, raising our voices, fighting, and one guy in particular, a senior counterterrorism official in Europe, I told him I was coming to meet him, and I told him, be prepared, because I'm coming to yell at you. And he knows that I mean it. And I came in ready for blood, and I gave my thing, and he said, you're right. I said, I'm ready for blood, don't disappoint me. And he said, look, I'm gonna tell you something. This individual had recently been to Lebanon, and recently met with one of the individuals who then was assassinated. This individual said to him, Hezbollah's gunning for me. And then he came back, and not long later, there are things that are happening that are affecting the way Europeans are looking at this. It's not just that France doesn't want to do something because it's worried about Lebanon, but because what is happening in Lebanon and what is happening in Syria, I think, is going to unfortunately get worse, and it's going to drive the Europeans to want to do something about Hezbollah. You don't have the debate anymore. There's no debate of, should we do something? Is designation the right policy? That's their piece. Sometimes sincerely, sometimes not so sincerely. But as the Germans and others have said, there will be a consequence to the fact that Hezbollah has now tried, and in one case succeeded, in blowing things up in Europe. I think they're going to get to the point, somewhere right at the point where they're going to feel there's also going to have to be a consequence to what Hezbollah is doing in Syria. What Hezbollah is going to be, and is already doing, in Lebanon. The fact of what Hezbollah was doing in Iraq, and remember, that's what pushed the UK to do more. What Hezbollah is doing, again, at Iran's behest in helping to move weapons to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. A whole host of activities has nothing to do with Lebanese politics. So don't get me wrong. This is not pie in the sky. This is not, I don't mean to be Pollyannish. But I think the likelihood that something will happen, because at the end of the day, I think most European countries are going to realize that a designation is important, but it's just a designation. Some of the other things, some of the other options are actually much more severe, and they're going to opt probably for a designation. I hope they opt for a designation and do something with it, but if you look, for example, at the European Union designation of Hamas, which they finally did only after years when only the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, was designated, basically, the EU's done nothing with that. It was supposed to be used as a platform to do more. Today, the largest Hamas front organization raising money for Hamas in the world is based in the EU. Okay, so That's not necessarily the best of news, but the fact is I think that they're going to see that there's an opportunity. Then Washington and others will have an opportunity to say, look, we've done this, now you have the platform and the authority to do furthermore. And again, at the end of the day, I think there's going to be pressure within European countries for European services to be able to investigate a group that is now blowing things up within their borders.
I would just add on these, just to dovetail on this last point, well, I think, I hear what you're saying about fundraising, but on the other hand, the Europeans, to their credit, have held the line, largely held the line in terms of avoiding political meetings with Hamas representatives in Europe. There's been isolation. Same type of isolation does not exist with Hezbollah. And both of these groups crave political legitimacy, crave a platform in the public sphere. So I think it's important. I don't know if Europe's going to go that far in terms of replicating the 2003 decision to ban Hamas. In terms of Bulgaria, I would just add that, once again, Hezbollah murdered a Bulgarian national. The chief priority, from my perspective, of every sovereign country is to protect its own citizens. In this case, Bulgaria has a vested interest. On the EU level, the 27 members also have a vested interest to protect their citizens and, of course, tourists and other folks who are visiting. I think there were some more questions in the back.
Hello, I'm Ian Stone from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. I'm still trying to weigh Hezbollah's allegiance or loyalty to Iran. Do they now receive more money from Iran or from their criminal enterprise in North America, Europe, South America, and does that, will that affect their loyalty to Iran?
It fluctuates over time. Hezbollah is believed to get as much as about $200 million a year from Iran, plus supplementals. So they got, we believe, something like $50 million after the July 2006 war. That is not a constant. I had a piece in Foreign Affairs a little while back pointing out that at one point a bunch of things happened at once. Some sanctions were hitting Iran all of a sudden. The price of oil had dropped, and Iran had to cut back its funding for Hezbollah suddenly without warning by up to, I think it was up to 35 or 40%. I mean, really severe cutback. If you're Hezbollah, you'd much rather. They had their own sequestration, exactly. It was temporary. It may ours be as well. If you're Hezbollah, you'd much rather Iran say, I'm sorry, we're cutting back the next 3 shipments of rockets. But you tell me you're cutting back the next 3 shipments of cash, they had to lay off people. They had to shut down certain social service activities. It was a real crunch for them. Because of these types of activities and because of the simple opportunity, and once you touch the kind of sweet taste of criminal activity, it's hard to give it up, it's so lucrative. But because of this, they have become much, much, much more involved in criminal activity. We don't have firm figures, and anybody who tells you that they do is lying to you. But my sense is, and the potential certainly is, that Iran is already making more money through criminal activity, possibly several times more money than it gets from Iran, because if you look at the narcotics industry alone, and again, we're only talking about movement and laundering of funds. Look at the Lebanese Canadian bank case, Ayman Juma, Shekri Harb, and others. But if you look at the international narcotics industry, the UN estimates that it's a, Sam, what was it, $330 billion a year, something like that? It's a huge industry. Now, if that's a UN estimate, the actual numbers in the book, again, you're just going to have to read the book. It's a huge number, and if that's the UN estimate, it has to be a lowball. If you're inclined for that type of activity, you want a piece of that. The potential for them to make a lot of money, South America, Africa, these huge diasporas where there's a lot of corruption and criminal activity, in Europe where they're raising money in all kinds of ways, charities and otherwise. Still in the United States, though we've shut down most of their charities and we're really cracking down hard on their criminal activities. Canada, there's potential for a tremendous amount of money. I look at Hezbollah and I see the potential for them to be, burning both ends of that candle. That is to say, raising a lot of money on their own, still getting a lot of money from Iran.
Just one quick follow-up. This is not to say that because they have these alternative sources of funding, that means it leads to autonomy from Iran. Because even with the trade, the drug trade, there was it's a rumor, but in 2010, I think, or maybe 11, there was a report in the German press as well that noted that the Quds Force commander in Beirut, not the guy that was killed, the actual Quds Force commander, who's also, his alias is under designation by Treasury in 2010, that he was advising Hezbollah on the drug trade to Europe, and so the Quds Force is deeply involved in that as well, but also in running day-to-day finances and financial, there was a wave of financial corruption in Lebanon, the Salah as-Din case, pyramid schemes and so on that cost a lot of people a lot of money in Beirut. But the Quds Force guys are the ones who are handling their finances as well. So Hassan Mahdavi is the guy's name in Lebanon, the Quds Force commander in Lebanon. And there's plenty of reports that he was in charge of these finances. So just not to confuse the fact that they have alternate sources of funding with independence from Iran.
Our time is up, although if our panelists are able to stay and schmooze a little bit longer, I certainly encourage folks to do that. I've heard a lot of things today. One is that while Hezbollah was essentially born in Lebanon, today could be considered sort of a subcontractor, if you like, or as you said, a strategic partner of Iran. I've heard that the Burgas and Cyprus investigations are but the tip of the iceberg. I've heard that there's growing momentum in Europe like never before to designating, possibly designating all our parts of Hezbollah, and a range of other really interesting things that provided me and hopefully the audience here with food for thought. And with that, I encourage you to have different kind of food. And in the back of the room, please, as I say, stick around, speak to our panelists. And thanks to everybody for coming today. Thanks to my colleagues, Boris, Jamie, and to the whole team. And Benny. And Benny has one more point to make.
One point takeaway is buy Matt Levitt's book.